Wrath by great authors Steinbeck.
John Steinbeck.
Steinbeck.
Okay, I chose to do my speech presentation on our book assignment on oral reading. That was lesson 2. And the book I chose for this assignment is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And this was a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. The Grapes of Wrath is a landmark in American literature. It is a powerful story of the survival of human dignity and spirit under the most desperate conditions. When The Grapes of Wrath first appeared in 1939, it electrified America, still recovering from the Great Depression. Driven from their Oklahoma farm by the encroachment of large agricultural interests, the Joad family sets out, like many generations before, to the promised land of California. As they travel across the country, joined by countless other unwilling migrant families, the Joads confront the cruel realities of an America divided by the haves and the have-nots. First of all, I would like to know how many in this class have read the book, The Grapes of Wrath. Okay, while I'm reading this passage from the book to you, I would like to know if you, the audience, discover any metaphorical meaning in the description of the weather, which I'm about to read. If you haven't read the story, it might be a little bit difficult. I will now read to you a passage from The Grapes of Wrath. Over the high coast mountains and over the valleys, the gray clouds marched in from the ocean. The wind blew fiercely and silently, high in the air, and it swished in the brush, and it roared in the forest. The clouds came in brokenly in puffs and folds and gray crags, and they piled together and settled low over the west. And then the wind stopped and left the clouds deep and solid. The rain began with gusty showers, pauses, and downpours. And then it gradually settled to a single beat, rain that was gray to see through, rain that cut midday light to evening. And at first the dry earth sucked the moisture down and blackened. For 2 days the earth drank the rain, until the earth was full. Then puddles formed, and in the low places little lakes formed in the fields. The muddy lakes rose higher, and the steady rain whipped the shining water. At last the mountains were full, and the hillsides spilled into the streams, built them to freshets, and sent them roaring down the canyons into the valleys. The rain beat on steadily, and the streams and the little rivers edged up the bank sides and worked with the willows and tree roots. Bent the willows deep in the current, cut out the roots of the cottonwoods, and brought down the trees. The muddy water whirled along the bank sides and crept up the banks until at last it spilled over into the fields, into the orchards, into the cotton patches where the black stems stood. Level fields became lakes, broad and gray, and the rain whipped up the surfaces. The water poured over the highways, and cars moved slowly, cutting the water ahead and leaving a boiling, muddy lake behind. The earth whispered under the beat of the rain, and the streams thundered under the churning freshets. When the first rain started, the migrant people huddled in their tents, saying, "It'll soon be over," and asking how long it likely to go on. And when the puddles formed, the men went out in the rain with shovels and built little dikes around the tents. The beating rain worked at the canvases until it penetrated and sent streams down. And then the little dikes washed the beds and the blankets. The people sat in wet clothes. They set up boxes and put planks on the boxes. Then day and night they sat on the planks. Beside the tents the old cars stood, and water fouled the ignition wires, and water fouled the carburetors. The little gray tents stood in lakes, and at last the people had to move. Then the cars wouldn't start because the wires were shorted. And if the engines would run, deep mud engulfed the wheels. And the people waded away, carrying the children, carrying the very old in their arms. And if a barn stood on high ground, it was filled with people, shivering and hopeless. Then some went to relief offices, and they came back sadly to their own people. "They's rules. You got to be here a year before you can get relief. They say the government's going to help. They don't know when." And gradually the greatest terror of all came along. They ain't going to be no kind of work for 3 months. In the barns, the people sat huddled together, and the terror came over them, and their faces were gray with terror. The children cried with hunger, and there was no food. Then the sickness came, pneumonia and measles that went to the eyes and the mastoids, and the rain fell steadily, and the water flowed over the highways, for the culverts could not carry the water. Then from the tents, from the crowded barns, groups of sodden men went out, their clothes slopping rags, their shoes muddy pulp. They splashed through the water to the towns, to the country stores, to the relief offices to beg for food, to cringe and beg for food, to beg for relief, to try to steal, to lie. And under the begging and under the cringing, a hopeless anger began to smolder. And in the little towns, pity for the sodden men changed to anger, and anger at the hungry people changed to fear of them. Then sheriffs swore in deputies in droves, and orders were rushed for rifles, for tear gas, for ammunition. Then the hungry men crowded the alleys behind the stores to beg for bread, to beg for rotting vegetables, to steal when they could. Frantic men pounded on the doors of the doctors, and the doctors were busy. And sad men left word at country stores for the coroner to send a car. The coroners were not too busy. The coroner's wagons backed up through the mud and took out the dead. The rain pattered relentlessly down, and the streams broke their banks and spread out over the country, huddled under sheds, lying in wet hay. The hunger and the fear bred anger. Then boys went out, not to beg, but to steal, and men went out weakly to try to steal. The sheriff swore in new deputies and ordered new rifles, and the comfortable people in tight houses felt pity at first, and then distaste, and finally hatred for the migrant people. In the wet hay of leaking barns, babies were born to women who panted with pneumonia, and old people curled up in corners and died that way, so that the corners could not straighten them. At night, frantic men walked boldly to hen roosts and carried off squawking chickens. If they were shot at, they did not run, but splashed sullenly away, and if they were hit, they sank tiredly in the mud. The rain stopped. On the fields, the water stood, reflecting the gray sky, and the land whispered with moving water. And the men came out of the barns, out of the sheds. They squatted on their hams and looked out over the flooded land, and they were silent. And sometimes they talked very quietly. No work till spring, no work. And if no work, no money, no food. Fella had a team of horses, had to use them to plow and cultivate and mow. Wouldn't think of turning them out to starve when they wasn't working. And them's horses were men. The women watched the men, watched to see whether the break had come at last. The women stood silently and watched. And where a number of men gathered together, the fear went from their faces, and anger took its place. And the women sighed with relief, for they knew it was all right. The break had not come, and the break would never come, as long as fear could turn to wrath. Tiny points of grass came through the earth, and in a few days the hills were pale green with the beginning year. I think the ending of this chapter, and for some sort of hope for the people, for the migrant people, just because of the new year coming. And was anybody able to detect any hidden meaning in the description of the weather?
It was like an attack on the people, like war tactics.
In the description of the weather?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Destruction. I thought with the immigrants coming from one side and the clouds coming from the other and meeting in the California spot was the...
Well, I don't really know anything for sure, but what I got from it was that, like with the description of the clouds coming in, where it describes the clouds coming in brokenly in puffs and folds and crags, and they piled together and settled low over the west. I felt that they were describing the immigrants coming into California slowly, gradually, until there was a whole lot of them. And then also there was and I just caught on this. I've read the book 2 times, and this is the first time I caught on to this. And then also when it's describing how the trees were uprooted and worked at the willows, I feel like that's the same as the people being uprooted from their own land. And so I feel like the author, I'm not sure though, but I feel like he was using this as a metaphor, describing the way things happen. And because it's such a long, elaborate description of the weather, I feel like that's probably what he was doing. Now I'm going to read, in this assignment you're supposed to compare this to another piece of inspirational literature. So what I chose was a verse from the Bible, Ecclesiastes from the Bible. One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to the place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place hence the rivers come, thither they return again. I think this verse suggests that there is hope found in renewal, and that's the feeling that I got at the end of that chapter is with renewal within the next year that things will change, and that man is not defeated as long as there is hope of that continual renewal, and also that hope is not lost as long as the will to survive prevails. That's it.